Welcome in to the New Orleans Pelicans podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. A podcast dedicated to everything you need to know about the squad. Hear from players, coaches, broadcasters, and those who cover the NBA on a daily basis. It's time to flock up. The New Orleans Pelicans podcast starts right now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the New Orleans Pelicans podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. Player profiles continue. Jim Eichenhofer, Pelicans.com. We looked at the starters. This week, the reserves is what we're going to be taking a little deeper, look at.
Yeah, we're going to have Jose Alvarado for Monday. Then we're going to have Kelly Olynyk Tuesday, Bruce Brown Wednesday. Obviously, those two guys came in the trade from Toronto for Brandon Ingram in February. Then Thursday, we're looking at the second year of Jordan Hawkins. Then Friday, closing it out with Jeremiah Robinson Earl.
And again, if you're listening to this and you go, you went over through the starters and you do it, Pelicans.com. If you miss any of those interviews, literally look for the player's name. And there is an accompanying piece that Jim Eichenhofer did as well, where he writes about what we talk about with a little addition or two, some stats and some insight into that. So be sure to check out not only the website, but also any of our other player profiles. When you look at Jose Alvarado, Jim, I go back to when we were in Nashville and the start of training camp. And one of the things that I remember early on in those workouts and days and scrimmages was you could see a different body language, demeanor, and approach to practice, to scrimmage with Jose. He and James Borrego, the assistant head coach for the Pels, they were there to win that practice, to win that session, to beat DeJounte Murray, to beat Zion Williamson. It got, I wouldn't say testy, right? It was competitive. I loved
intense,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, and I loved that. And you could kind of see that he was trying to be a leader. And that's the difference, right? This is a guy that, oh, look, it's cute. He makes a steal. We called it the GTA. He's a fan favorite. Wow, he brings energy. Right? Since he's been here, Jim, every year he's added to his game. Taking a look at this past season, where do you put Jose in his game now and what he's been able to do?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about this a little bit with Antonio Daniels, but I mean, just across the board, he had career highs in a bunch of different categories. Some of that was just his minutes went way up. His responsibility was very high at the beginning of the season and then later at the kind of the tail end as well. But I mean, I think he, just made another step. His 3-point percentage was pretty solid again. Just showed, progression in his game. I mean, one thing that I always keep going back to with him, though, is, I talked about this a lot last season, that they were 38-18 last season when he played. They were only 11-15 when he didn't play, which was the biggest discrepancy on any player of the main guys on the team. That was the biggest difference between record. And then this season, I mean, this isn't something that I think he's going to want to have on the bottom of his basketball card or his resume, but I mean, he was the only player on New Orleans that when he played, they didn't lose twice as many games as they won. So, for example, in the, not to pick on one guy, but in like Javonte Green's games, they went 11-39 in his 50 games. Every player on the team except for Jose, they basically lost 2/3 or more of the games played. Jose barely cleared that at 19-37. But I mean, you think about this, they were 19-37 when he played. He missed 26 games. They only won 2 of them. So that's one of the things also that we're going to talk about with Antonio Daniels is how much the Pelicans missed Jose during a specific stretch of the season. But I mean, we just continue to see that, they didn't have a great record when he played either. But I mean, geez, when he wasn't on the court, it was like almost impossible to get victories during those stretches. And I mean, that's something that's been a theme, I think, throughout the time that he's been here is that, there's a million different ways that you can measure stats and go through the analytics and blah, blah, blah. But it's like, to me, at the end of the day, the winning and the losing, it just seems like it's always been very evident with him.
Yeah, and it's great to hear and see, I guess, his growth in his own words, right? How he's had to adjust. And I go back to it and we talk about it with AD, about him talking about how, hey, these professional starting point guards that get all that money, there's a reason. There's a lot that goes into it. It's a lot easier said than done, I guess, to be a starting point guard in the NBA. Well, Antonio Daniels, he has a lot of insight, and especially when it comes to Jose Alvarado, here's our conversation with him. All right, welcome back as we come back with Antonio Daniels, analyst for the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network. And we were just talking about DeJounte Murray earlier this week. Now we're going to talk about another guard. You got the starting point guard and then the point guard that became the starting point guard, but it's just as important as the starting point guard, even if he comes off the bench, in Jose Alvarado. Did I describe that accurately at all?
I dare you to say that again 3 times really fast. Really fast. Yes, that's a very description. Even though it's difficult to describe, especially this year, what Jose's actual role was.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I wrote about in the written piece of the season recap with him was you could kind of chart the prominence of his role. You could chart based on the availability of the rest of the team. So he started a bunch of games in November when, I mean, we remember some of the rotations that they had at that point in the season. It was like a few guys on 2-way contracts, a lot of guys you didn't know a ton about, players that they just signed off the street kind of. And then later in the season, he started a bunch of games at the end because it was a similar thing where they were down to 8 or 9 guys at the end of the year. So, I mean, it fluctuated a ton. But another interesting thing too is they had a stretch of 23 games in a row where he was out, and they only won 2 of those games. Wow. Which is one of those things where I've talked about this a lot the last few years, that if you look at the record when he plays versus when he doesn't, it's incredible sometimes to see just the impact that he makes. So,
and you know what, Jim, Gus, I don't think Jose even realizes the impact that he makes. No, I'm sure he doesn't. Mm-hmm. I'm sure he doesn't. I remember during that stretch that you're talking about of those 23 games, talking to Willie about it. And Willie said, you know what, AD, man, you know what we really miss? And I was like, what? He said, Jose.
Yeah.
And I just kind of looked at him and he said, man, just that energy. Yeah, like people you don't realize what you have until it's not present, until it's not there. And for Jose, you wouldn't believe how many conversations I've had with that young man about just understanding who he is and how much he means to the success of this team.
Yeah.
That energy is contagious. It is contagious. And you see it all the time throughout the league. You know, guys that play a certain style of basketball, and what it does is it lights a fuse in the entire arena. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not like a play is made and it's like, oh, yeah, your teammates are pumped up. No, a play is made and then the entire arena, or you can hear the entire arena kind of coming to a crescendo because of a energy play that you made. I think that speaks to the impact of Jose Alvarado.
Yeah. You know, before we get into some of the specifics, and I'm going to throw a couple numbers at you about Jose Alvarado's season and just his impact. I mean, he's been here for 4 seasons now. I feel like people have a decent feel for him in terms of what kind of person he is, in terms of the way he approaches the game. I mean, is there anything else that you could tell us maybe that we don't know, or just a different way that you could describe, you know, just from the conversations with him, just the way he approaches the game or his job? It just seems like he's, you know, as you kind of mentioned, he's kind of Mr. Intensity. He brings a ton of intangibles that you can't really measure.
Yeah, for me with Jose, what you see is what you get, and I love that. Mm-hmm. There's no mixed messages. He tells you exactly how he's feeling. And there's not a person that I've seen and talked to that I feel like wants it as much as Jose does. And maybe that's a part of the underdog story. Maybe that's a part of the story of feeling like, you know, you've been overlooked. You know, I've heard Willie Green say numerous times, you know, you won't find a quote unquote small guard in this league who isn't scrappy, you know, like who doesn't feel like he has to claw his way to the top. And Jose is a great description of that. Like, there's not a time on the floor where you're going to question Jose Alvarado's heart. There's not a time on the floor where you're going to question Jose Alvarado's effort. He approaches every game. And I think this is a cliche statement that you hear throughout the NBA all the time. Play every possession like it's your last. Like really? That's not true. That's like telling people live every day like it's your last. Mm-hmm. Like, it sounds great to say. It sounds great to say, but it's not realistic. We take life for granted. Jose does not take any rep that he has on that floor for granted. Because in his heart of hearts, he actually plays the game like he feels like it could be his last game or it could be his last year. And I think that's a good thing to a certain degree because it keeps him hungry.
Yeah, I love watching him pick up guys for 90 feet and just playing like relentlessly the way he does. You know, one of the things about his season that I was wondering for your thoughts on was, too, you know, we talked about his role fluctuating a lot. It seemed like in the last month of the season, he also took on this much bigger scoring role, and it was kind of reminiscent of the way he plays when he's on the Puerto Rican national team, where they need him to be a go-to guy. They need him to get his points. You know, he's scoring 20 points in some of these international games all the time. What did you see from him in terms of what he showed maybe during that part of the season? Was it something that was, you know, something that you knew he could do, or something that you were glad to see him to kind of bring that just a different side of his game out at that part of the season?
I wasn't surprised. I mean, I've seen him do this, right? We saw him do this during the Olympic trials and the Olympics. But here's the thing, that's not your role here. It's a lot of guys in this league. I think the biggest misconception in this league is because guys can't do something, they don't see them do something, people assume that they can't do it. No, that's just not your role. That's just not what your role is for this particular team. But when you traded Brandon Ingram and Zion went down, and then Herb went down, and then Trey went down, and then CJ went down. So now that when you go down, DeJounte went down, you go down, and Jose's the next guy in line. So, yes, that may not have been your role up to this particular point. But for this last 15, 20 games or so, this is that guy we need you to be. And it's amazing to me how much Jose has fluctuated. Because he started 23 games this year. That's more games than he started in his previous 3 seasons combined.
Yeah.
So you have to understand what he was asked to do in his first 3 seasons here, and then what he came into this year expecting. He came in expecting, you know what, 15 to 25 minutes, I'm going to come off the bench, I'm going to be a game changer, I'm going to be an Energizer Bunny, I'm going to change the format, I'm going to change the trajectory of the game. And you know what happened? When guys start to go down, now the role that you came in anticipating is not the role that you have to play.
Sure.
So you have to have the ability to adjust on the fly. And I think Jose did a great job of doing that.
Couple stats for you, and you can decide which one you want to talk about, maybe both of them. First number is 15, and that was his rank among all NBA players in assist to turnover ratio.
3-1.
Yep. He was 3.01 was assist to turnover ratio. The year before it was 2.93, so it was almost exactly the same. And then the second number
No, Jim. You can't do that. And
what
I'm speaking from a guy who led the NBA in assist to turnover ratio. That's like saying a house is $500,000 or saying a house is $4,999. No. 3-1 is completely different than 2.9-1. Just saying. But
I like it. And then the second number I'll throw at you is he had, we kind of referenced this a little bit already, but he had 4 games of 20 plus points this season. In the previous 3 seasons that he played in the NBA, he did that 3 times. So he had more 20-point games this season than he did in the previous 3.
I will take the points one. And that goes back to what we were just discussing, though. You know, it's about opportunity. It's about opportunity. You look at him this year, he averaged a career high in points and assists, you know, but he also averaged a career high in starts. So when you have a career high in points, assists, and starts, that means you also have a career high in quote unquote opportunity.
Yeah.
And you know what he did with that opportunity? That speaks to the 20 points per game 4 times or that you just referenced, right? You go back to his previous seasons, he wasn't playing this amount of minutes. He wasn't, because in the previous seasons, you're playing 15 minutes a game, 17 minutes a game, 19 minutes a game. And now when those minutes start to increase, your role starts to increase, opportunity starts to increase. Now it's simply about you taking advantage of it. And along with some guys not being available, right? Certain high-powered guys, the firepower that this team has when everyone's available is completely different. Jose doesn't have to play that role. Now his job is to simply come in and to change the energy in the game. But when you have those guys sidelined, now you're asking them to be that Puerto Rican version of Jose Alvarado that represented his national team. Sometimes you're going to have to score that basketball.
Yeah. Lastly, for me on Jose, what do you think are the next steps from him? What do you think are some of the things that we want to see from him, going forward into next season? Obviously, we hope we never go through a season like we just did where
Right.
it's constantly changing in terms of the rotation. But I mean, when you talk with him, I mean, what do you think is kind of the next area, the next step that he's going to take?
The mental part of feeling like you are a starting point guard in this league. I think that's the big thing. Whether or not you are starting or not, you need to have that thought in your head that I am a starting point guard in this league. We've had many conversations about TJ McConnell. Whether or not TJ McConnell was starting, he thinks he's a starting point guard in this league. And it all starts with the mental aspect. And I've told Jose numerous times, for me, I can understand the want to start, but the trust is really concerned with whether or not you're finishing games. Because your ability to knock down open shots, your ability to bring energy, your ability to make smart decisions, pick up 94 feet, a lot of times will have you on the floor to finish games, which to me is far more important.
I think one of the things that stood out to me as we wrap up with Jose, with Antonio Daniels here, one of my favorite bites came towards the end of the year, AD, when he talked about how those guards that start, the starting point guards, they make a lot of money for a reason, and that it's hard. And one of the things you mentioned about one of the things that I think is good as a person is to understand your limitations or your role. And it's not a negative thing. It's understanding, okay, this is what I need to work at, or this is why it's hard, and this is why it's so good, and it works. Because AD, I think him understanding that is probably why I think the most important thing he did this year was this aspect of it. We talked about, and you guys did towards the end of the season, how well Carlo played, how well Antonio Reeves played, how well all these other players, ancillary guys played that came off. I mean, Quinones, some guy that just showed up on Thursdays, right? That doesn't happen if your point guard's not playing well, distributing the ball, creating space, and giving them open shots. Am I wrong on that?
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's why the point guard position is so crucial to the success of a team. You can go throughout, look at the playoffs now. A lot of these teams that are still playing and competing, they have really good guard play. Go to the NCAA tournament. Really good guard play, and you advance. Because, again, your job as a point guard is different than anybody else's job. But the difference between a point guard's job and everybody else's job is a point guard's job is to keep everybody happy. There's no other position that has to do that. Nobody. You got to make sure he's happy, that he wants to train, that he wants to run. He knows that he's a lob threat. A four-man has to be happy with his ability to space the floor, a three-man running the floor, a two-man coming off screens. It's nobody else's job to make sure that the point guard's happy, but it's the point guard's job to make sure everybody else is happy and that everybody else eats. Easier said than done, but I think Jose did a great job, especially at the end of the season that you referenced, Gus, in making sure everybody felt involved, right? Whether it was Antonio Reeves or whether it was Carlo running the floor. You get Quinones running the floor. Different guys that were out there that you didn't expect to be playing with when the season started, but one way or another, you found a way to make it work. You problem solved.
Right. We're going to wait to see a couple months here, but I think one thing that's going to be interesting is we talked about with DeJounte Murray, the other player you spoke about, and with Jose Alvarado. I think both of those guys could be Joe Dumars type guys, right? I mean, those practices are going to be intense.
That's right.
Those guys know what it means by that. So I think that'll be an interesting dynamic to see day one of training camp, how that goes at those workouts, because you don't have to tell those two guys to get your group, get ready to go, even in a little scrimmage or in a game to 10 or
That's
something
right.
of that nature.
Jose's the loudest one in practice. He is the loudest one in practice. He's the one that's running around, that's talking trash. And again, you need this. You need, you say teams need a glue guy or a guy to do all the dirty work. You also need a guy on that roster when it's a random Tuesday and guys are tired to bring that energy to the gym. And Jose has from day one since he got here, even before he got a guaranteed contract, he's always been that guy.
Antonio Daniels, as always, appreciate the time. Another great season. Hopefully we'll be talking postseason in a year from now, man. Appreciate the time.
I hear that. Appreciate you, Gus.
Thanks,
and
AD.
You too.
Our thanks to Antonio Daniels. As always, a pleasure for the Analyst on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network. Jim, the playoffs continue. Anything that stand out to you in the weekend other than the wonderful GIF you sent me of a dancing wolf mascot?
Yeah, his name is Crunch, by the way, just for the record. Yeah, the Timberwolves mascot. Very exciting, and excited to get that victory. Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty incredible weekend in terms of the game winner that the Nuggets had at the buzzer. I mean, that was as close to the buzzer as you could possibly get. Aaron Gordon throws down a Jokic miss. It was kind of funny that they were asking Joker, what did you think when you let go of that shot? And he was like, this is going to be bad. But it turned out great for him. I think just overall, one of my biggest takeaways is that I feel like I haven't looked at the TV ratings, and I'm to be honest with you, I'm not that interested in them. But it does feel like there's been kind of a swing towards a lot of people are talking positively about the way the playoffs have been, and it's one of those things where it's like you see such a difference between the playoffs and the regular season. And speaking of which, another thing that stood out to me this weekend was, do you realize that J.J. Redick in the second half of the Lakers Game 4 against Minnesota played the same 5 guys all 24 minutes? And apparently that's never happened in the history of the NBA, at least as far back as they can track the minutes by quarter and by half. So, I mean, that's pretty interesting strategy to think about. Just the fact that you see the significance of the game, that a coach would never do that in regular season because people would be like, what are you doing? Well, why would you wear your guys out in February or March?
Yeah.
But, I mean, you saw that they go into that game down 2-1. They know if they lose, they're down 3-1, and it's something like 5% of the teams in the history of the NBA down 3-1 have ever come back to win. So you know this isn't our season, but it's darn close to it. So I thought that was really interesting to see the way that he handled that. And obviously part of that is that, you don't necessarily have a ton of faith in some of your bench guys to be able to play minutes if you literally don't use any of them in the second half. But I mean, that was quite a game. That's been a fun series so far. And then lastly, this is actually related to the Pelicans a little bit. Damian Lillard with his injury and, potential for that to be something that affects him long term. I love Damian Lillard. I love his Portland years. I kind of wish, hindsight's 2020. I kind of wish he had stayed there because his 2 seasons with Milwaukee
been disastrous
for a lot of for a lot of things that are reasons that are out of his control. Giannis was hurt in the playoffs last year. Chris Middleton had a bunch of injuries. They had to trade him. So it's like I'm sure what he envisioned when he went there it's been so far from what he thought it was going to be like. But related to the Pelicans though. I think it's going to be interesting to follow what happens with Milwaukee in the offseason and then the way that they approach next year, because Milwaukee doesn't have their draft rights over these next few years, and the Pelicans are specifically related to that. The Pelicans have swap rights with Milwaukee in 2026, so if Milwaukee, say, has a really bad record, the Pelicans are going to end up with a high pick from them as part of the Drew Holiday trade going way back. Mm-hmm. Pelicans also have Indiana's first-round pick next year as part of the Toronto trade. So that's top 4 protected. But you're looking at 2026, something to keep an eye on. I don't think we're going to focus a ton on this as time goes on, but just in the back of your mind to think about that, these are things that could affect the Pelicans. I do think, though, that given Milwaukee, a lot of people are already circling for Giannis and saying, like, does he want out of Milwaukee, which – personally, I can't stand that talk because we've gone through it before here. But I don't think the Bucks can go into the mode of like, yeah, we're going to rebuild, because when you don't have your draft picks, it doesn't really make any sense to do that. It's going to be several years before they get to the point where a bad record during a season is going to result in a high pick for them. Mm-hmm. A bad record over the next few years will result in a high pick for someone else. So I don't think that does them any good. But just an interesting thing to think about in terms of that Milwaukee's future is kind of somewhat indirectly tied to the Pelicans as well.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting for sure. And to your point that you're bringing up, you don't want to think of the draft, but that goes into, what off-season moves you make, how you go out through the season, knowing where you go, and then come trade deadline, all that stuff in the coming year. But in the meantime, I'm with you. And oh, by the way, the 2 teams had the most wins, one in the East, one in the West. One sweeps in OKC and Cleveland going into
Monday night. Yeah, they're on the verge.
Yeah, exactly. So not unexpected on that, but some other interesting games there for sure.
Yeah, there have been. I mean, those teams have continued to follow up on the dominance that they showed during the regular season, and I think also probably demonstrate a little bit of the advantage of being the 1 seed of having to play a team, and I think in both cases with Miami, where they had to win a couple play-in games to sneak into the playoffs, and then Memphis, which was super banged up and then had even more injury issues during the playoffs. It's definitely been beneficial for OKC and Cleveland to be the 1 seeds, and you know what? They earned it. They deserve whatever help that gives you as far as, starting the playoffs with undefeated record so far.
Mr. Jim Eichenhofer, as always, a pleasure and appreciate it. And also appreciate Antonio Daniels. Again, if you missed any of the interviews of our past, go to Pelicans.com. Jim has an accompanying write-up and also all of our other interviews. Until next time, we'll see you again on the New Orleans Pelicans podcast.
Thanks for listening to the New Orleans Pelicans podcast. Join us 3 times per week on Pelicans.com, the Pelicans mobile app, the iHeartRadio app, or where you get your podcasts. And be sure to give Jim and Gus a follow on X at Jim_Eichenhofer and GCat_17. We'll see you next time, right here on the New Orleans Pelicans podcast.